So anyways, I'm really happy to have on the panel here today, we have Saif Savage, Edgar Dueñez-Guzmán, Gemma G. Clavel, and Rediet Abebe. Thank you all so much for joining us today. So I guess with that, and get started. So first, I'm honored to introduce Saif Savage. Saif is currently a visiting professor at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. She directs the HCI Lab at West Virginia University and co-directs the UNAM Civic Tech Lab. She holds a bachelor's degree in computer engineering from UNAM, a master's and PhD in computer science from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has worked at Microsoft Bing, Intel Labs, and the University of Washington. I'm also happy to say that she is a co-organizer of RIA. Dr. Savage was named, sorry, let me turn off my notifications. Dr. Savage just named one of the 35 innovators under 35 by the MIT Technology Review for her civic tech research. She also recently won a $2.5 million NSF grant to study AI systems to help rural workers to develop their digital skills to access better jobs and fight disinformation. Dr. Savage's work has been featured on major news outlets such as the BBC, Deutsche Welle, if I'm saying that properly, Vice News, and the New York Times. We're really happy to have you here, Saif. And I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share a video that Saif sent. If you'll just bear with me for a second.
Thanks, it's an honor to be here.
Thanks, Saif. One moment. Okay. Oh, and actually, this is probably the perfect time to note that in the Hopin platform, you'll be able to see all of the panelists in different windows at all times. If you would like to focus on the slides that a panelist is sharing, you should just double click on their screen shared window, if that makes sense. And it'll maximize the screen so that you can see the slides in more detail. So right now you can double click on the screen share that I'm doing. So I'll go ahead and play this video. Please let me know if the audio is not working for some reason. All right. Thank you so much, Saif, for that exciting video. It's a nice way to wake up to this. Anyways, I think there's still a few minutes left. Is there anything that you would like to add to this before we move on?
Well, I don't know if anyone would like to, if people have any questions. So basically, overall, my research focuses on thinking about how we can use artificial intelligence to empower gig workers. So gig workers have been feeding into the artificial intelligent algorithms that we have, right? They're doing a lot of labeling. They're helping us to improve the AI that we have. And yet, what we have been doing is we have actually been de-skilling a lot of these workers. And so because we're giving them a lot of monotonous tasks to do, where they actually don't have ways in which they can develop new skills, or, and also we found it through our studies that a lot of these gig workers are actually earning less than minimum wage. And so I'm very interested in thinking about, well, you have these workers who are becoming very familiar with artificial intelligence. They're working close hand in hand with it. How about we now start to think about how we can use artificial intelligence to help these workers start to develop their skills, be able to build career pathways, and then also start to access new types of jobs and also earn higher wages. And so that's a great portion about what my work has been working on. We recently won an NSF grant related to, okay, so let's apply this so that we can help rural workers be able to develop their skills, and so that they can access new types of jobs. And I think this is a really big opportunity in terms of not forgetting about these populations, but really designing with them. And so I'm excited to be in this panel and discussing more about how we can use AI for good. In particular, to help these communities not be de-skilled, but rather be able to access new jobs and exciting jobs as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again. Anyways, before moving on, I'd just like to remind folks to please post any questions that you might have on the menti.com page, which you can find on the pinned post at the top of the session's chat tab. But however, please also feel free to ask questions in the chat itself if you would like. Great, so thank you so much again, Saif. So next up, we have Edgar Dueñez-Guzmán. Edgar Dueñez-Guzmán is a senior research engineer at Deepmind. Previously, he was at Google, where he developed the first machine learning system to select the index for image search. During his academic career, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Biology at KU Leuven, working with Tom Ventilers in social evolution in microbes. And he was also a research associate at the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, working with David Haig in social evolution and imprinting. We're really happy to have you here today, Edgar. If you wouldn't mind, please taking it away.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I was here in the first RIA, and it's great to be back. Even though I couldn't be here last year, I am here today. And so what I'm going to be focusing on is telling you sort of my own quest to apply AI to the greatest challenges of our time. So when I think about the challenges, I think about using AI in two different ways. Either you look at the challenges that you have in front of your face and that you can tackle, and then trying to solve those. And the other approach is trying to solve fundamental problems that hopefully will be able to unlock solutions in a more scalable way than sort of resolving one problem at a time. So I first started with this idea of, well, there are very important challenges, and one in particular that is sort of very important for me is climate change. I want to solve climate change. I always wanted to sort of save the world with science since I was very little. So when I joined Deepmind, I joined the energy initiatives that we had. And when we think of energy, we think about it both from the point of view of the generation of the energy and the consumption of the energy. On the consumption side, so we want to increase the efficiency of existing systems. And on the generation side, we want to increase the value of renewable energy. So perhaps you are aware, but if not, I'm going to tell you, right? We have a project that aimed to make the cooling of data centers more efficient. And the number that has been thrown around is that it was 30% more efficient. And so let's put that into context. I'm just going to round up. I know this is a bit cheeky, but let's say a third, right? So we made them a third more efficient. Data centers consume 3%, and that's why I'm going to make it a third, 3% of the global energy budget of humanity. If we could roll out this technology to all of the data centers in the world and get the same performance benefit of a third, then we would be having an impact of 1% of the energy budget of humanity. So this is important. This is like really impactful work, right? Another thing that we were doing is renewable energy is great because it doesn't produce any carbon, but it has a problem that is less valuable than other more predictable type of energy, right? It's unpredictable. We don't know when the wind is going to blow. We don't know when the sun is going to be up. So our approach was to use AI for predicting and scheduling wind energy. We were controlling about 700 megawatts of power in the central Midwestern United States. This is sort of the equivalent of a medium city of 500,000 people. And we were sort of trying to predict ahead of the next day how much energy we were going to produce. And so the number that we sort of did in that pilot was we were able to improve by 20% the revenue of the wind energy, which if it were to be rolled out to multiple places, then you could imagine that it will make the creation of new wind farms more appealing to investors, and therefore increase the proportion of renewable energy in the energy grid, right? But I want to take a step back, because while I was doing this and it felt really good, I was thinking, well, how about we take the approach of machine learning and try to solve something more general, something more scalable, right? And I realized that what I really want to do is solve the cooperation problem. It's the meta problem, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So this is a set of challenges that the UN or the World Bank have identified in our time. So these are great challenges of our generation. And if you look at them, how many of these are social? I would argue all of them, but let's just say generously, most of them are social, right? Things like global warming with the Paris Accord, if every country were on board with that and actually doing everything that they can to make it happen, it's a coordination problem. We could solve climate change in this way. Things with geopolitical situations or poverty, hunger, redistribution of wealth, all of these things are social problems. They are not technological problems. Technology helps us solve it in spite of the fact that we are failing socially to solve them, right? So what I have always been passionate about is trying to understand this from the point of view of sociality. And how are we going to do it? Well, in the words of Richard Feynman, what I cannot create, I do not understand. So the way that I want to do it is by creating models of cooperation. But how do you understand human cooperation? Well, you have more or less two extremes of the approach. One is the purely theoretical. You can take the economic theory approach and abstract everything out into a pure decision of strategies in a matrix game, like the prisoner's dilemma here that I'm showing, in which you're sort of talking about sort of stability of solutions and rationality of decision making. And this is great. It's very beautiful. Mathematically, we have gotten a lot of intuition about how these problems are hard and why. It's a matter of incentives. We haven't understood that. But it has limitations, right? So humans are definitely not perfect rational decision makers. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the work of Elinor Ostrom, which has influenced us very greatly. And in this perspective, you look at historically how humans have resolved these large social dilemmas and coordination problems in practice, right? You look at how fisheries have done it over hundreds of years or even thousands of years sometimes. You look at how ranchers have dealt with the issues of pastures that are shared or things like that. And she identified these two axes of the rivalries, or whether something is subtractable, whether when someone takes from it, it's not available for someone else, or whether it's excludable, whether you can privatize it. Privatization is a way to solve a lot of these social problems, but it's not the kinds of problems that we care about. Like the environment is not privatizable, right? Or at least it's not desirably privatizable. And in particular, so there's this commons thing in which you can destroy it, but it's actually not possible to exclude others from it. So for instance, in this case, I'm showing a picture of My Dear Mexico, in which there's a big tradition of destroying the forests in order to turn them into farmland. And it makes sense, right? So it's the benefit of the individual who is turning it into farmland because they're going to get an income out of this, but it's at the cost of everybody else. And this is the tragedy of the commons, the very famous thing. So what we do is take, okay, well, the theory is too much, the empirical is a different end of the spectrum. What is in between? And so the answer is, we think, multi-agent reinforcement learning systems. We can use them as a model of humanity. Key word here is model, right? It's not going to be perfect. It's just going to be more realistic than the traditional economic theory, perfect rationality systems, because we have agents that would be like with having bounded rationality, partial information, intrinsic motivations, things like that. They're better models of humanity than the traditional economical models. And they're also much more empirical. And I'm going to show you how we do that by taking this example of destroying the forest, right? And we are going to turn it into a simulation. Let's say a grid world, a very simple grid world, in which, let's say, you have a set of apples that you can harvest for reward, but if you over-harvest them, then you destroy it. There's no more apples for anyone else, right? So it's like the traditional tragedy of the commons. Or we can create another one in which the environment has already been destroyed. It's already polluted a river that you need in order to irrigate the orchard. And when you clean it, right, you need to devote effort in order to clean it so that you can grow apples later. So it has some environments that capture some of the aspects of this problem. And on the other hand, you capture something fundamental about humans. So in this case, humans dislike fairness, right? So this is one possibility that you can take inspiration from, and you turn that into a mathematical formula for your agents. The details here don't matter. The important thing is that you have this idea of you care about doing better than others. It's an inequity aversion, and you care about doing worse than others. And both of them are present in humans, and they're more or less independent. I can go into that detail later if someone has questions. But the important thing is that one of them is very good at solving one type of problems, the one of provisioning to create the social good, and the other one is very good at solving the other kind of problem, the one of stopping overexploitation. So what we have found is that these inequity-averse agents that we are creating, artificial agents that are more or less trying to mimic some aspect of humanity, are able to solve these social dilemmas by resisting the temptation to pull ahead others, or by punishing and discouraging free riding. And now, while these things were handcrafted, there's no reason why they need to be, right? So follow-up work has been done to make this into an evolutionary decision of, say, culturally learning what rules everyone should be abiding to. So I want to close by saying that basically this. The biggest challenges of our time are social, right? So we need to create solutions to those. But in order to actually responsibly affect change in the real world, right, we need to understand how those interventions, how those actions are going to affect and interact with extant human systems, institutions, values, and societies. And that's where artificial intelligence and multi-agent reinforcement learning system in particular can help us do this better. And with that, I'm going to close. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll take your questions later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk, Edgar. From a personal standpoint, I also find the idea exciting that, from working in AI, work in AI can help inform our knowledge about ourselves and society. So thank you so much for that. Great. So next on the panel, we have Rediet Abebe. So Rediet is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and an incoming assistant professor at UC Berkeley EECS. Abebe holds a PhD in computer science from Cornell University, where she was advised by John Kleinberg, as well as degrees from Harvard and the University of Cambridge. Her research is broadly in the fields of artificial intelligence and algorithms, with a focus on equity and justice concerns. She co-founded and co-organizes Mechanism Design for Social Good, MD4SG, a multi-institutional interdisciplinary research initiative working to improve access to opportunity for historically underserved and disadvantaged communities. She is also a co-founder of Black in AI. Abebe's work has informed policy and practice at various organizations, including the National Institute of Health and the Ethiopian Ministry of Education. Throughout 2019, she served on the NIH Advisory Committee to the Director Working Group on AI, whose recommendations were unanimously approved by the General Director's Advisory Committee. Abebe was recently named one of 35 innovators under 35 by the MIT Technology Review. She has also been honored by Elle as a woman transforming technology and the 2019 Bloomberg 50 list as a quote-unquote one to watch. It is such an honor to have you on here, Rediet. If you wouldn't mind, please take it now.
Thank you so much. Just to confirm, do you hear me fine and you see my slides and the slides just move? Did the slides just move?
Yes, it's all working perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, that's just confirming. It's a new system for me. Okay, very good. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event, and it's really wonderful to be sharing this virtual platform with you all, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I'll give quick remarks. I think I'll try my best not to run over, but if you have to cut me off, please let me know, because I can go on for a while. So yesterday, or actually 3 days ago, I had an opportunity to give a talk on my dissertation, which I submitted back in 2019. And I had an opportunity to really think about what's changed since I started my PhD in 2015, and what's changed even since I defended and graduated in December of 2019. And so much has changed. Things look very, very different than they did before. We know that police brutality of individuals in the US, especially Black Americans, has reached a tipping point. Immigration rights are under constant attack in the US. They have always been, but it's sort of reached a tipping point. And we're in the middle of a global pandemic that's infected 24 million people. That's probably a lower bound on what's going on. And at least 800,000 people have died, of which 180,000 are based in the US and 115 are based in Brazil, among other places, right? So things are looking really dire. And what's really disheartening about this is that these issues that we're dealing with are intersecting with each other in incredibly unsustainable and crushing ways. So for instance, if you look at the number of cases in the US, if you compare white non-Hispanic people versus Black Americans or Hispanic and Latino persons, the rates go up by 2.6 to 2.8 times as much. Hospitalization is close to 5 times as much, and number of death is twice as much for Black Americans. Right, and these are, this is just like the best estimate that we have. The reality could actually be way, way worse. And so, these underlying inequalities that we have are now kind of feeding each other in incredibly unsustainable ways. Likewise, if you think about immigration in the US, for instance, we now have a lot of evidence that undocumented people who are essential to the economy, and especially now during this pandemic, are shut out of a lot of the support that is being given to a lot of families here in the U.S. Right. So really, this kind of immigration issues that we have with the pandemic is also intersecting in ways that are really devastating for a lot of families. So, people here, we're thinking about social good, right? We think about, okay, what are we going to do about this? So if you, like me, like AI, like algorithms, like data mining methods, then you might think that these set of skills might be useful in this space to try to get us out of the kind of the mess that we're in, right? That maybe we can play a role here in conjunction with other people. But even there's bad news, right? We've seen that algorithms that have been deployed in practice have really caused a lot of harm. So you might think about criminal justice systems and algorithms just deployed there that are disproportionately biased against Black people and people of color. We have evidence of algorithms used in healthcare systems that are discriminating against Black folks. And even in situations like where we design algorithms with marginalized communities in mind, like, designing algorithms to alleviate poverty, there's evidence that it actually ends up sort of perpetuating these inequalities, that it ends up really ratifying the belief that we have that there's scarce resources and we have to just sort of shuffle them around rather than trying to get to the root of the problem, right? So even, when we're trying to help, it seems like that doesn't always pan out so well, and it can really backfire. And critical scholars have pointed out a bunch of issues in using computing for social good. The main themes that we've seen is sort of solutionism, right? This tendency to assume that computing algorithms will solve social problems, or sort of tinkering, where we take problematic features of social political systems as fixed, and then we sort of try to tinker around them rather than trying to get to the root of the problem. And also there's a sort of diversion that happens, right? Where rather than really thinking about, let's say, poverty or inequality, once we start thinking about algorithms for poverty, then actually we sort of distract ourselves away from the poverty to the algorithm, and also even maybe other forms of addressing the social problem, right? So this is, this is a lot of bad news. We're kind of in a mess, and maybe we want to help, but actually there's a long history of us potentially hurting even when we're trying to help. So a really natural question to ask, and one that I asked myself throughout my graduate career, is, well, do we have any role to play? Is it better that we just kind of wrap up our whole community, our whole field, and sort of move on and try to spend our time on other forms of contribution? So we thought very critically about this with my colleagues that you see listed here. We thought about whether we can sort of cut a path between sort of critical ways of thinking and the more solutionist attitude. Can we kind of keep in mind the criticisms that we've heard, but also recognize that social change is really the work of many hands, and maybe there's a way for us to contribute as an ally to broader social change in conjunction with other disciplines that may also be playing a role here. And we were able to identify several different roles for computing. I'm not going to go through all of them in the interest of time. I'm also keeping an eye out on the time. But one of them that I just want to discuss maybe very briefly is computing as a diagnostic, meaning that a lot of the social problems that we have, we know that they're a problem. We know, let's say, poverty is a problem, mass incarceration is a problem, all these things are a problem, but we don't necessarily always know the extent of the problem. We don't necessarily always, we're not always able to sort of fully characterize it. And so we think that computing can play a role in not solving problems, but really just measuring them and diagnosing them and kind of fully characterizing them, especially if these problems are manifesting themselves in technical systems. One example that you might already know is the work of Latanya Sweeney from 2013. So this is kind of maybe the first of its kind in a sense. This was from about 7 years ago, where Latanya Sweeney wrote this paper on racial bias in ad delivery, where she showed that names that are commonly associated with African-American individuals, like Latanya Sweeney, if you search for those, you tend to see more like ads on the site that are more, like, has Latanya Sweeney been arrested, or public records, or, defaulted, and things like that, right? And so she was able to sort of robustly provide evidence, right? So she wasn't solving anything here, but she was saying, look, this problem exists, and I can show you that it exists. We can kind of like measure the extent to which it's a problem and who it's a problem for. And since then, we've seen a lot of work of this kind, right? You might be aware of facial analysis work by Joy Bohamwini and Timnit Gabru on gender and skin tone bias. You might already be aware of bias and word embeddings type work. What we talked about in healthcare algorithms is an example, racial bias and speech recognitions, and my own work also in health information bias on search engines, right? So this is just a random sampling, or maybe not so random, but this is a sampling. There's a lot of work of this kind now that's not intended to really solve anything, but just show that these inequalities and biases exist in systems, and hope that informs policy. And of course, even in doing this, we have to be very careful, right? So we have to recognize that diagnosing a problem doesn't mean that you're automatically going to come up with a solution. It's very important to not confuse diagnosis of the problem with the treatment of the problem. It's really tempting to say that if we know the extent of a problem, then actually we'll be able to come up with a solution. But we know that that's not the case. In the US, we have massive, mass incarceration issue and homelessness issue, and yet we haven't really done much about it, right? And so in some ways, actually, just like additional measurement isn't necessarily going to add anything. So we really should be aware of that. A quote that I really like by Ruha Benjamin says, "Data, in short, do not speak for themselves and don't always change hearts and minds or policy." So we really should think about that, that's not always sufficient. But of course, computing can also inform treatment, right? So if you look back, let's say in the mechanism design community, our contributions have helped in allocation of life-saving organ transplants, allocation of public goods like seats in public schools, allocation of low-income housing resources, food stamps, home energy assistance, and all sorts of things, right? So we actually have been able to also inform treatment. But in that setting, one thing that we haven't always recognized is that computing has a role to play as a formalizer, which is that when you're talking about computing, you have to be very explicit. Like if you're talking about algorithms, you have to be explicit about the input of your algorithm and what your goals or objectives are. And in that way, actually kind of helps us understand these social problems. So a lot of times you might hear things like, the social worker must act in the best interest of a child, or housing assistance programs aim to help the most number of people. But what do we actually mean by best interest of a child or help the most number of people, right? And computing forces you to be very explicit about that. And one work that I was able to do, which I really won't be able to get into, is to think about how the process of formalizing your objective function, right, to go from the most number of people to saying, okay, actually mathematically this is what I mean, can actually be used as a way to understand the problem better and actually as a weapon. And so what we did in this work, which I'm only briefly mentioning, is that we showed that two objective functions that look similar, actually, they both look reasonable, can actually yield drastically different results. And so we've been able to use that to argue that, for instance, if you're thinking about eviction and housing instability, it really isn't a problem of like, if we just formalize the problem better, or if we just allocated things more efficiently. It really is a problem of we just don't have enough resources that we're throwing at this problem. And we can show this to you by actually efficiently solving an algorithmic question here, but showing you that under two very natural assumptions of what you might be trying to optimize, you can actually be helping entirely disjoint sets of people. So that says maybe we should be providing more resources. So in that way, it can also be useful. There's other roles here that I won't get into because I think I'm almost out of time, but I recommend looking at the paper, Roles for Computing and Social Change, if you want to look at these other roles as well. But I do want to take 30 seconds to close to say that there's a couple of things that kind of get lost in our computing communities, right? One is that there's a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, I'm a researcher, this is the engineer's problem, or I'm a researcher, this is the policymaker's problem, and sort of to delegate these important tasks of translating our research to practice to someone else and not taking responsibility. And I think we've seen that fall apart many, many times. I think it's time that we really take that to heart and reclaim it, and really just recognize that we have a responsibility to shape how our research is understood and used. The second thing, which is related, is that we really need to be building genuine partnerships with domain experts and affected communities, rather than just doing what we typically do anyway and just sort of saying, I think this helps people that are impacted by this, and not actually following through or not designing together, as the first speaker said. And this is something that we think about a lot in the Mechanism Design for Social Good research initiative. I'm happy to talk to you about that model that we use there if you would like to chat some more. And the last thing I'll say is that who's in the room really matters. I think this is a crowd that I don't really need to say this to, but there's some really sad statistics that you may not be aware of. I was only made aware of it in the past year, where we looked at, since the CRE survey they do annual surveys, they looked at people who graduated with computer science PhDs. This is just one sample, right? And they showed that out of, close to 1,500 people in the US, actually in North America, that graduate with computer science PhDs, only 13 of them are Black. And then only 21 of them are Hispanic of any race, right? So these are tiny numbers. These are people that basically probably all know one another. And yet we have 1,500 people that are graduating with CS PhDs. So this is also something we think a lot about in our Mechanism Design for Social Good initiative, and also, of course, in Black in AI. And folks might already be aware of the work of Latinx in AI and Disability in AI and Queer in AI and a bunch of other communities that are working towards better inclusion and representation of individuals as well. And with that, I'll stop, but I encourage you to look at MD4SG if you want to learn more about any of this. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rediet, for such a thought-provoking talk. And yeah, I especially appreciate the note that you made at the end, calling for, how really as computer scientists, we have a responsibility to the community and, not just outside of ourselves, but within our own spaces. Mm-hmm. All right. I'd like to take this pause just to remind members of the audience to please post any questions that you have either on the chat or on the menti.com page that we shared. And with that, we now have Gemma G. Clavel, who will be closing off the panel before we start off with the Q&A portion. Gemma Galdon is the founder and CEO of Eticas Consulting, where she is responsible for leading the management, strategic direction, and execution of the Eticas vision. Her multidisciplinary background in the social, ethical, and legal impact of data-intensive technology enabled her and her team to design and implement practical solutions to data protection, ethics, explainability, and bias challenges in AI. She conceived and architected the algorithmic audit framework technology, which now serves as the foundation for Eticas' flagship product, the Algorithmic Bias Tracker. Under Galdon Clavel's leadership, Eticas has forged the development of a new market in digital ethics and trustworthy AI, reaching all verticals, including social services, healthcare, finance, government, education, cybersecurity, and more. She also serves as a tech ethics advisor at international and national public and private institutions. We are so excited to have you here, Gemma. If you wouldn't mind now, please taking it away.
I'm sure. I don't have slides, so I'm guessing I don't have to do anything.
Yes, you're good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, if members of the audience wouldn't mind just double-clicking on Gemma's image so that you can, I guess, focus on her screen, that'd be great. But yes, you're good to go.
Great, there's no other screen, it's just me talking. So thanks for the invite. Also, thanks for putting me last, because it's always great when you don't have a lot of time to be able to build on what others said. And some of the things that people have said already are very much linked to what I'm going to say. So some of the previous speakers presented their ongoing research. I started my PhD in this space 15 years ago. And by the time I finished it over 10 years ago, I was so outraged and scandalized at the things that I saw in the way that technology works. And I did my PhD on the social impact of policing technologies. That I decided I needed to take my PhD to the next level. And I was not outraged because it was policing technology. I was not outraged because the police were making bad use of the technology. I was surprised and concerned about the social dynamics that I saw underpinning the way that we develop and deploy technology everywhere, but also in very sensitive settings. So what I decided was to turn my research into a machine for change, and Eticas is that machine for change. And so what we do is try to create better tech, and specifically better tech practices, because the time of principles is gone. We have all the principles. We know what it means to build responsible technology. We know that transparency is important. We know that accountability is important. We know that the human in the loop is important. We know that do no harm is important. But how do we translate these into technical specifications? there's not enough people contributing to that space. There's a lot of people talking about the principles and making general commitments to general things that are never landed, but there's not a lot of people working on what does it mean in practice? Where will I limit my technology? Where will I identify harm and stop it from happening? We unfortunately, we don't have that. So what we've done at Eticas is try to fill that gap and be one of the actors that does this. And so we have different strategies. We have a consultancy which works B2B on auditing algorithms. So we work with partners to improve the technical and machine learning systems that they have. And my outrage and concern continue because we're finding really badly designed algorithms that are working in very sensitive areas. But we also have the foundation, the Eticas Foundation, that is working on the social impact of data-intensive technologies in different domains, labor, gender, education, smart cities, migration, borders, any of the things that we have expertise in. We try to raise awareness, but also create specific, not only technologies, but also policy recommendations around those areas. And so one of the things that concerns me when we talk about social impact technology is that I fear we may be replicating, and the previous speaker mentioned this as well, we may be replicating some of the problems we identified in the technological sector that doesn't care about social impact, which is this idea of solutionism. We start thinking about problems from the perspective of the technology and not the social problem we want to solve. So we're not thinking, okay, so what problem do I have? Poverty. How do I solve it? And technology may or may not be part of the answer. But what we tend to see, even in the social impact space, is that people think, oh, I have this tool. What can I use it for? So I have blockchain. What problems can I solve with blockchain? That's the wrong way of going around it. You need the problem first. Because if you do it the other way around, you're reproducing technological solutionism, and you're not helping in the space of social impact. Because what is social impact? Wars have amazing social impact, but it's not good social impact. We don't want wars. Wars are not desirable. An algorithm that gives bad credit to women has amazing social impact because it's reproducing existing discrimination, but it's not good social impact. We don't want algorithms to replicate the discriminations that we already experience in the offline world. An algorithm that systematically puts Black Americans at the end of the line in the emergency room because the training data has less data on Black Americans, and because in the past, Black Americans have been treated worse by the medical system. We don't want those kinds of algorithms. We don't want algorithms to further stigmatize vulnerable collectives. When we are using biometrics as a proxy for identity, because hey, we find that it's better to cross borders without going through a human. It's so much easier. But then we start seeing migrants mutilating themselves because when we've introduced biometrics, what we've done is turn your body into your enemy. And what you want is to forget about your nationality. You want to hide your nationality, and your identity is not in your passport anymore, but in your body. It's in your fingerprints. The only way to hide your nationality, your identity, and there's legitimate ways to want to hide your nationality and your identity because you need to escape dangerous situations. And the only way to escape now is to mutilate yourself. So the human rights implications of some of the technical decisions that we're making without any awareness of their social impact is just mind-blowing and really, really concerning. I could say the same about misinformation, surveillance. So I'd say the first thing we need to ask when we talk about social impact technologies, why? What is the problem you are trying to solve? And that may sound very, you may think, of course everyone thinks about this, you start with a problem. Well, actually, in the technology world, most people never start with a problem. In the technology world, you have a hammer, and so everything looks like a nail. So you're not allowing yourself the space to think about complex social technical solutions to complex social problems because you already have the answer. You want to deploy AI. But your goal is not to solve the social problem. Your goal is to deploy AI. And that is a fundamental problem in the way that we approach how we do technologies. So we need to ask why, but we also need to ask how. If you're going to deploy AI to have some impact, You need to ensure that you mitigate for bias, for instance. And a lot of people are not doing that. But it's not only about bias, it's also about power. We started working several years ago with some trade unions on the impact of technology in the workspace. And one of the speakers also mentioned this. And one of the things that we realized is that every single technical solution we were looking at was benefiting the employer. The market is not offering technical solutions to empower workers. So the market is further reinforcing the power of the already powerful. How will you account for power imbalances in your technical solution, in your AI system that you want to deploy for social impact? And I think these are the crucial questions that we need to be asking. So one of the things that we're doing in order to address this and to help people think about those things is create a certification procedure or mechanism to give people guidelines on what does it mean to do AI for social impact. And so what we ask is, okay, so you want to do AI for social impact. What is your mission? And that means what real world problem are you trying to solve? And we use the UN development goals for that. So pinpoint which of these areas are you contributing a solution to, and make sure that you are able to define that problem. We ask the organizations we work with about their internal processes, because doing technology responsibly is also about who you are. So if you're going to be selling algorithms, AI for social impact, it is important that your AI is not biased, that your AI does not reinforce power imbalance, but it's also important to ask, so where do you pay your taxes, if at all? What are the working conditions in your space? These are also important questions that end up impacting on the products and the things that we create. We also ask, of course, about the tech. So your technology, how do you protect personal data? How do you mitigate bias? How do you incorporate transparency and accountability mechanisms? So can you please list all those things? Can this be specific? Don't just tell me I have the best intentions in mind. Tell me exactly how your intentions translate into actual practices in your field or in your initiative. And finally, we ask for impact. So what impact do you think your technology will have, not today, tomorrow, and next year? What impact will it have in 20 years? And we've been so bad at estimating impact in the last few years. When the internet started to be a thing of the masses, we were all so excited that we forgot to do this exercise, to think what could go wrong. We were also positive about the possibilities of the internet, peer-to-peer publication and relationships and an overturn of hierarchies. Here we are 30 years later. Is the world a better place? I'm not sure. So how do we think about those things in order to be able to have at least some tools to mitigate for the negative impact that we already anticipate? And not just the impact for your immediate stakeholders, but we've learned a lot from environmental impact here that another speaker also mentioned. Impact is not only about your immediate stakeholders, but it's also about the non-users who may be affected by your innovation. So when you build a road, when you do an environmental impact assessment, you're not only looking at the drivers who will use that road, but also looking at the pollution and how pollution impacts those living around the area where the highway is going to be built. So we also want to make sure that we incorporate those invisible stakeholders into the discussion, because if you're altering or impacting on power relationships, a lot of people who are not users will also be impacted by the dynamics that you are creating. So to summarize, because I don't want to take more time now, I would like to see questions. We need specifics in the debate around AI for good and for social impact. We need to be specific, and we need to go beyond good intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I fear that there's a lot of social impact AI right now that is doing more harm than good. Thank you so much.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for such an exciting speech. Unfortunately, it looks like we're running a little short on time. So for those that would like to stick around, we might bleed slightly into the next session. However, maybe a good first question to start with that I saw in the chat is somebody asked about what resources the panelists might recommend for someone interested in looking more into these topics could look into. We don't necessarily have to talk about that, but if the panelists wouldn't mind, if anything comes to mind, just posting it on the chat as resources for our audience members to look into. As well as, you know, if you have any contact information that they might be able to reach you out for questions, that would be wonderful. Anyways, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the Q&A. I'll see if we can maybe do about 10 minutes of this. Let me see. I think one that was given in the chat for all. So the question is, how might we design computing platforms that are not patronizing towards the populations you are designing for? Which I think also kind of gets at, you know, like how do you operationalize the measurement of, you know, variables that tend to be like very abstract and semantically fuzzy, if what I'm saying makes sense. Do the panelists have any thoughts on this?
I think that it's extremely important to do co-design. And so through co-design, it's a way in which you can really start to better understand the needs that people have. I think it's also important to understand the biases that we as designers can also have when we are creating things for different populations. For instance, yesterday we were talking about how sometimes even when we're creating things for people with disabilities, we as designers might limit what we allow people with disabilities to do. For instance, maybe we don't see a blind person being able to use a paper cutter, but why couldn't they use a paper cutter? And so I think that having co-design is very helpful to break those barriers about what do these populations really need, and that way we don't come off as the parents that are trying to save them, but we let them be able to define how they want to use technology, what technology is impactful for them.
Thanks, Saif.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I think humility goes a really long way. It really, really does. I think a lot of times folks think that, well, if I just go to the communities that are affected and I talk to them enough, then I'll know everything there is to know about the community and I can do it. And that's kind of like the best that you hear, right? A lot of times you don't even hear that. You just hear the, well, my tools are powerful, so I'm gonna go and like help you leapfrog poverty or whatever ridiculous claim it is that people are trying to achieve. So I think really humility goes a long way. I think it's been a little bit actually disheartening, I'll be honest, to be involved in the space for the past, several years and seeing our conversation evolve from, we'd really like to have more people from diverse backgrounds involved in the community. And I thought eventually we would get to a point where it's like, okay, we actually should be equally respecting everyone involved. But I still sense that there's a lot of kind of proxy representation that's happening. That's sort of like, well, if I just like talk to you guys enough, then I'll know what's important to you, and then I can go ahead and solve it. And I think we're just not going to get anywhere with that. People are the best advocates for themselves. Communities are the best advocates for themselves. And so you really want to get to a point where communities themselves can lead the charge in what's gonna be in their communities.
Thank you, Rediet. Does anyone else have any thoughts to add to this before we move on to the next question?
I completely agree with what's being said. So for the sake of time, I'll shut up.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay, yeah, if there's no more thoughts, I might move on to the next question. So I think that this could also be asked to everyone. Although I don't know if maybe Edgar has thought about this specifically in the multi-agent systems domain, but the question is, how can you model the society with agents, i.e. you have millions of agents, each with complex relationships with others. How can you make this computationally tractable? And I think this goes to everyone in the sense that, if we want our algorithms to have an impact on society, or we want to measure a societal thing, that at some level involves a bunch of humans, and how how do we abstract away the computational intractability of that, if the question makes sense?
Yeah, I can start, and obviously anyone else wants to add. So from my perspective, I think that the most important thing is whether you are talking about something relatively small scale on a handful of individuals, then I feel that multi-iterative reinforcement learning is a very good tool, because then you can explore specific inductive biases that could work to sort of tackle those problems, and maybe humans have them and how you do it. But at the larger scale of things, then I think it's much more like mechanism design that Rediet was talking about, right? So it's about sort of designing the incentives, because we kind of know how humans will react on aggregate. They will follow the incentives, right? And they will not do it perfectly, they will do it imperfectly, but to the extent that we can change those incentive systems, those mechanisms, then we can, in some ways, design better societal systems to achieve the outcomes that we care about.
What I would add to this is you can't do it alone. Your expertise and knowledge alone will not be sufficient to model complex social processes. So get help and get multidisciplinary. And probably read 1984, because modeling society creates basically a big brother. So you may want to bear that in mind.
Oh, yeah, not now. Yeah, in terms of multidisciplinary, yes, absolutely. We've had people from neuroscience, people, I have a background in evolutionary biology, for instance. We have people from cognitive psychology. Yes, we do need, we have ethicists. We need a definitely multidisciplinary team. Absolutely agree with that.
Well, thank you all so much for your thoughts. I might ask one more question, but since we are a little over time, I guess I'll, for people that might be trickling out, I just like to thank the speakers so much for being here. It has been such a pleasure listening to you speak about your work, and I'm sure that the audience has really enjoyed hearing about everything. But if you wouldn't mind just sticking around for one last question, I think this could also go for everyone. So the question is racist, and I think this can be more generally said, like problematic behavior built into algorithms, or is it emergent behavior from a bias in the training data that goes unnoticed by researchers until it's in a production environment? Yeah, I think a lot of people have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'd say it's both. And there's been a lot of talk about training data and how the problem is society, and because society is biased, of course technology is biased. And I would say, no, that's not true. It's both. You may have the best training data. You may have worked on your training data to ensure that you remove the bits about that data that are negatively impacting on specific communities. You may have mitigated against some of the bias you may find. But at the end of the day, an algorithm is a machine of discrimination. And that's a good thing. The algorithm being a machine of discrimination means that we don't give public housing to rich people. So that's good. That's good discrimination. The issue is the bad discrimination. And what algorithms do is look for models. So everyone who's not mainstream becomes a problem for most models. So modeling is problematic in itself. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do algorithms. It means you need to be aware that the way your algorithm thinks is also a problem, because in the end, it tends to privilege the normal, and the normal is always male and always white.
Yeah, I want to mention something really quickly that one of the things that we have started to do at my lab is for every data set that we are releasing, we're providing a data sheet where we're explaining possible biases that can exist in the data as we see it. We're also providing explanations about why we created that data set. We're also doing this for the APIs that we're creating and also the AI models that we're building. And so I think that having explanations, and this goes a little bit related to what Gemma was talking about, it's important to contextualize why you have certain data, possible biases that exist with the data, possible biases that exist with the data models that you're using, and even with the labelers. So a lot of the times, for instance, you have crowd workers who are helping you label the data. what biases do those crowd workers have? This is also a conversation that many times we're not having. And so I think that it's important to be transparent, not only in visualizing, for instance, providing data visualizations, but in providing data sheets through which you can explain to people your intentions and possible biases that can exist across the whole pipeline.
I really appreciate both of these answers. I think one thing I'll add is this conversation about just like one point of the pipeline, like the training data or whatever, is just so clearly a red herring. I mean, come on, right? Like, let's just move past it. It's so clearly a red herring because it kind of reminds me of the way where, like, you know, you look at graduate programs and you say, hey, why don't you have work? Why is everyone here, you know, like, why don't you have any like Black or Latinx people? And people are like, well, you know, they don't really major in computer science, you know, they don't really have, like, in high school, they didn't have this exposure, that exposure. It's like a way to just say, I'm not the problem, it's, you know, everything else that came before us that was the problem. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but actually you were also part of that problem, right? So if you have, even if we focused on like bad training data or whatever, what have you contributed to improving those data sets, right? Improving the labeling of those data sets, the collection of those data sets. How have the algorithms that we've deployed so far actually led to those historical injustices being worse than they are, right? So we actually have played a role there as well. But it also is a red herring because it assumes that everything else in the process is fine. It's just this one thing, and if we can solve this one thing, then we've solved everything. You clearly haven't. If you have the world's best data, whatever the hell that means, then you use that to target and kind of like imprison poor people. Okay, right? That's not a data problem. It's still a problem nonetheless, right? And so I really, you know, I call bullshit on the training data conversations. It's very clearly a red herring. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Are there any final thoughts on this note?
I would just like to mention, right now I saw that Mexico has been doing a lot of really neat work related to like fighting data biases. I really like the work that Haddock's Human Networks is doing. I saw that they're in the chat. And so they've been really trying to fight how in Latin America we start to think and realize about these biases. And so I think that it's important to also empower like all of the players that are like that are doing hard work to mitigate these things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Saif. And anyways, I think with that, we are running quite a bit over time, so I might close things off. But I wanted to thank the speakers so much again for the wonderful talks and such an invigorating Q&A. I really wish that we had more time to continue the conversation. But yeah, it has been such an honor to have you on here. And I hope that the audience, everyone continues to enjoy the conference today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.